Hello, everybody. Welcome to the final piece of our EDS presentation, where once again I'm batting cleanup, or as I like to think of it, what you've seen is the opening acts, and you're now getting the headliner. So what I'm going to do is what I normally do, which is walk you through an overview of what's going on in the economy and where I think that's going, but more importantly, how that ties back to our industry. Then I want to talk a little bit about stuff closer to home for me, which is what I've been up to since I last spoke to all of you guys. And then finish it up with some takeaways and stick my neck out as I normally do and talk a little bit about what I think is going to happen. In this case, over the course of the 2020s, or what I've been calling the Roaring 20s. So with that as the setup, let me jump right into some hardcore economic trends. This is from my friends at ITR, and what they're doing is looking at leading indicators that give us some idea, actually with a high degree of accuracy in the case of ITR, of what's coming up in terms of the ultimate economic indicator, which is gross domestic product, or GDP. What you can see here in the 2021 forecast are some very strong year-on-year changes for these economic indicators. Total retail sales up very strong, wholesale trade of durable goods, industrial production, this is a very good number at 5.3. But the other thing I think you'll notice is that as we move ahead a couple of years, things are starting to slow down. That doesn't mean we're going negative. It means we're posting a slower growth rate than what we've seen coming out of COVID. And obviously, I think everybody understands what's coming out of COVID. There's a piece of it that is certainly a bounce or a recovery out of what was a pretty steep decline last year. But as I go through this, I'm going to make the case for there's a lot more going on here than just a post-COVID bounce. So punchline here is for the U.S. In the second quarter, we saw record high in GDP, indicating that, in fact, the U.S. economy is fully recovered from the COVID shutdowns of the middle of last year. This has happened a lot faster than anybody was really predicting, even as the year wound up. And of course, in our industry, what we felt as the year wound up was some acceleration. I think you saw, or hopefully you've noticed, in Glenn's numbers and Mike and Don's numbers, that dip that we had related to COVID was actually very short-lived, and we came out of that very strong. And of course, as an industry, we're continuing to ramp as this year goes on. So part of what's behind this is a really interesting and very important observation, which it relates to the U.S. consumer. So in past severe changes in the economic cycle, what we saw was a big impact on the consumer. What we're seeing right now is actually delinquency rates on consumer debt are quite low, and saving rates continue to be quite high, which is actually, in a weird way, it's instilled a lot of confidence in the consumer. Consumers are people who work, and one of the things we're seeing is high quit rates in the unemployment statistics. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the overall impact of labor on our business in the future and the near term. And then finally, as I had said earlier, things are starting to slow down as we move into 2022, 2023. But again, we're actually growing at a pretty decent clip. When we look back at the GDP growth rates coming out of the 2008 recession, there's a very nice and consistent year-on-year climb, with the exception of 2019 and 2020 dipped a little bit. But the overall trend cannot be ignored. We now have a 10-year up and to the right trend that's pretty solid. We're back on that trend now. So that's the operating environment for our industry, our business. And I'm going to talk some about how I think actually we're pulling ahead of the operating environment. And this has been a pet topic of mine now for these EDS presentations for years. So let's take a quick look at the stock market, which by and large, I think we've all come to look at the stock market as a proxy for the overall economy, and I'm not sure that exactly holds true, but one of the things on everybody's minds is the stock market gotten too frothy? Are we going to see a reset? And there's actually a lot of evidence to suggest that there's some room to run. Right now, the S&P 500 is up about 20% year on year. And things like the underlying demand, the pent-up demand that we're seeing in all sectors are I think, going to continue to push that up. I see no reason to disagree with J.P. Morgan on this one. So one of the things, I think it was last year or the year before that I shared with you guys, is I map TTI results to Purchasing Managers Index. And I've, over the years, found some very solid correlation between them. And the Purchasing Managers Index is important because it is a leading indicator of what's going on in the manufacturing sector as well as some service sectors. But overall, it gives you an idea of which direction the economy is headed. So this is the U.S. ISM PMI. So this is the Purchasing Managers Index for the United States. And you can see here, some up and downs. This is a 312 rate of change. So this is this 3 months versus the same 3 months the prior year is what you're looking at here. You can see as we came out of COVID, this really strong climbing up to the right. And then more recently, the last couple of months, it's starting to settle down. The thing to remember, though, is anything above that 1.0 line that you see in the middle is growth. So let's look at that relative to TTI's performance. This is our bookings over time. And you can see our bookings, and you heard this from Don, you heard it from Glenn. Bookings are extremely strong, even coming into the third quarter here. And this is obviously, I believe, a pretty universal trend through the industry. And it's actually something that's got people concerned about. So anyway, here's what our bookings look like relative to PMI. Here's what our billings look like. And as I said, there's a very strong correlation here. PMI actually leads our results by about a quarter. So what's happening in PMI gives us a pretty good feel of what's going to happen in our results a couple of months early. So a couple of things I do want to point out. You see this big gap that happened in 2017, 2018. If you remember back in 2018, there was lots on allocation. We had a lot of component shortages, and our business started to pull away from the overall economy, as evidenced here. The industry was growing faster than GDP, but inevitably what happened is we peaked and then very quickly started to slide back down to kind of get back in sync with PMI. And then we were seeing this again in 2019. If you remember going into 2019, things were starting to soften. We were losing some momentum even before COVID, and then 2020, January 1st, 2020 hit, and we moved into this period that I've been calling the Roaring 2020s, and things were developing very nicely. We had some really good momentum going into the start of last year, and then of course COVID hit. So this is the momentum gain that I mentioned, and then this is the effect of COVID. So we saw, it was like hitting a brick wall, a very sharp, quick drop, but then obviously coming out of that, we've seen some really great strength. But I do want to caution on bookings, and I believe Glenn Smith touched on this as well, and here's the deal. Bookings obviously cannot continue to run at this rate. You cannot maintain a positive book-to-bill well in excess of 1 forever. And we know what's driving bookings. There's a lot of concern about double bookings, and of course there is some of that going on. But I think we're also a lot wiser and smarter than we've been in prior cycles. And I know the component manufacturers in particular are really keeping a close eye on this. Everybody's worried about a crash. What I will say about a bookings reset, which again is inevitable, and I'd bet money it's going to happen this year, is it's no cause for panic. In my own business, I've got most of next year's plan already on the books. And I've seen a lot of evidence of, not just in my business, but among us, my competitors and suppliers, where we're doing things like putting NCNRs in place with customers. We're safeguarding ourselves so that when things do start to normalize, when osmosis does kick back in, we don't see just a massive plunge in our results. And when bookings do reset, again, I do not think that's an indication that sales are about to plunge. I think this is actually a quite logical part of the process. So in sales growth, as I mentioned about GDP starting to soften, I think sales growth will start to soften into next year. The trick there, though, is I don't think it's going to soften necessarily because of lack of demand. I think it's going to soften because of lack of parts. So this ongoing pervasive shortage of components of all types inevitably is going to slow our customers down. We're going to see evidence of that in the second half of this year. And I worry that we're even going to see some of our customers, some of the younger customers in particular, we're going to see business failures in that group as they run out of parts and can't meet their commitments to their end customers. So very quickly, here's what it looks like for the rest of the world. Very strong numbers, as you saw in the US version of this chart, with some slowing going into 22 and 23. Globally, the economy is projected to grow 5.6%. Which is the strongest growth rate the global economy has seen in quite some time. And as we go into 2023, we will see this slowing as the bounce back factor of the pandemic starts to net out of everybody's results. So it's not all blue sky and sunshine, unfortunately. There's a couple of long-term economic headwinds that we're going to have to contend with through the 2020s. Contend with as an overall economy, contend with as a global society, and then contend with as an industry. And some of it's related initially to slowing growth rates. So this is births relative to deaths in the United States. And you can see we're getting to about a parity, where for every person that's born, there's a person dying. If that slips below 1, that's got long-term ramifications, not only for the labor pool, but for the tax pool and for everything else. So this has been one of the things that's been behind the long-term malaise that Japan has experienced in their economy. So this is an interesting long-term trend in actually not just the US, but most developed economies. And then I think this will resonate strongly with everyone. The other thing that, of course, we have to worry about is all of the debt we're piling on, especially related to addressing some of the insecurities associated with COVID-19. This is a long-term US debt as a percent of GDP chart, and you can see what's happened here is we've gotten to a point now that fortunately economists predict is going to flatline or plateau rather at a very high level, north of 100%, for a while before it starts to climb again. What I'm really worried about is we go out a few years and start to get into the 2030s, is there's going to be a lot of stuff that comes home to roost. But in the meantime, for this decade, I don't think debt is going to be that much of a problem. If we do get into a period of strong inflation, then debt is going to bite us because of the interest service on that debt. But right now at interest rates, the debt, as large as it is actually quite manageable. So if we take a little bit closer look at this is the US debt to GDP. Latest numbers on this is about $28.5 trillion and is approaching about 120% of GDP. And very quickly, the debt and GDP relationship, it's like your bank account. It's your income versus your spending. The GDP is the income, the debt is related to spending. So obviously, in the long run, we can't spend more than we make. So if we can't slow spending down, then what obviously we're going to have to do is figure out a way to, quote, make more. And unfortunately, when you're talking about at a federal level, what that means is increasing taxes. And I know everybody's getting ready to hunker down for that event. And I'll show you this in a second. Personally, I don't think that's party related. I think that's inevitable given what we're dealing with, and it didn't really matter who was sitting in the White House. I think we were going to have to see some adjustment in tax. So if we look at this from a global standpoint, it's actually even worse. So maybe we can take a little cold comfort in that. The global debt is actually almost 10x what it is here in the U.S. It's $290 trillion, which represents more than 3.5 times global GDP. So in the long run, on a global basis, this is extremely troubling, and that has ramifications for the U.S. because we obviously live and trade in a global economy. So coronavirus, of course, has added quite a bit of this. Here are some projections through this decade of what coronavirus is going to heap on top of an already fairly significant U.S. debt. Interest on the current debt, that interest service is running at about $1 billion a day. So, real money even for an economy the size of the GDP. But then related to this party aspect or this political aspect that I just mentioned, I wanted to share this with you because I do think we really need to try and depoliticize some of the problems that we're dealing with. And this is data from ITR, and what this is showing you is what the debt increase from one president to the next has been since they started tracking this, since we've had a two-party system. And if you look at the top, if you exclude the Civil War and World War II, because wars tend to really swell the debt, you can see there's not much difference between the two parties. In fact, that's the punchline here. This isn't a party thing, it's a policy thing. And again, the purpose in sharing this with you is just to get you to start thinking about the fact that this isn't really a politics thing, this is an economics thing. So, state of the union today. We've had a lot of disruptions. The one we're all talking about at the moment is the pandemic. Prior to the pandemic, what we were talking about is the U.S.-China trade war. We've been talking more and more about climatic disruptions to the industry, to the economy. There's a lot of stuff trying to tear things apart. And the fact that we are growing as well as we're growing, I think really does speak to the strength of underlying demand. So let's look at some of the things that are affecting the supply chain right now. One of the headline news, of course, is all around semiconductors, although this is much more pervasive than semiconductors. But one of the realities is the U.S. share of semiconductor output over the years has continued to drop. It was 20 years ago, globally, the U.S. was producing about 37% of the semiconductors consumed around the world. Today, it's about 12%, so it's a pretty big change. To address this, at last, the federal government is thinking a lot about semiconductors, and as part of the infrastructure bill has earmarked $52 billion, actually, for domestic production of semiconductors here in the U.S. That one of the good things about that is it should add about 400,000 jobs, and these are good paying jobs to the economy. So, sounds pretty good. Except when you look at what South Korea is doing, South Korea is going to spend more than $400 million to bump up their semiconductor production. And even the EU collectively is going to spend about $160 billion. So while the $52 billion, better than nothing, I still think it's inadequate given the importance of semiconductors specifically and technology in general to the long-term prosperity of our country. Historical microcontroller lead times, this is a kind of a proxy for what's going on in semiconductors, are now running about 5x, rather lead times are running about 5x what they have historically. And one of the things that is getting a lot of press is just how much of the industry is concentrated in the hands of TSMC in particular, especially many of the semiconductor companies are fabless, and TSMC is their fab of choice. Not the only fab, but the biggest fab and the one that's investing the most and is developing new technologies. They have all the vast majority of the leading edge process technology for semiconductors. And this is particularly precarious because there's growing tension between the US and China about the sovereignty of Taiwan. If you can imagine if the Chinese move on Taiwan, how disruptive that's going to be to the global electronics industry. So adding fab capacity, that is top of the news, what everybody's talking about. It's the key to solving current supply chain disruption in electronics. But interestingly enough, one of the things that I can't help but notice is where we're making these investments in the US. Intel in particular has been in the press a lot lately about investing in new fab capacity in Arizona, which is kind of interesting because fabs use a lot of water, and Arizona is not known for an abundance of water. Water shortages in Taiwan have already had an impact on the capacity that TSMC is able to maintain because there's been some unexpected droughts over there, which, by the way, things are only going to get drier according to the most recent UN report on climate change. So I wonder about this. Right idea, but maybe wrong location. So state-of-the-art fabs cost about $10 billion to build and take about 2 years. Although in this case, quite frankly, I expect they're going to run longer, mainly because the equipment you need to complete these fabs, it itself needs semiconductors. So the semiconductor equipment guys are also struggling to get parts. So let's talk about the ultimate catch-22. So as I said a minute ago, why semiconductors are dominating the news when it comes to shortages, especially automotive, which I'll talk about in a second. It is much broader than this. It's affecting passives, especially high CV ceramic capacitors. It's affecting connectors. There's a lot going on here well outside of semi. So even if we were to fix that, which is admittedly is the gating item, it's the longest lead time thing in terms of adding capacity. It's not like we get back to like nirvana and quote normal in the supply chain. Cost inputs, a huge problem right now. It's on top of everything else. Prices are going up. I know all of us are spending a lot of time going to customers with the news about, hey, we're going to have to not only charge more going forward, but we're actually going to need to start repricing backlog because things like copper's way up. Copper's been on a monster run. So all the raw materials are up. Energy costs are up. Taxes are starting to creep up. And then more recently, labor and transportation rates are starting to creep up. Transportation rates is more than creeping up. I mean, it's almost 10x since the start of COVID. So these are real costs that are starting to get passed along to the end users and ultimately to us as consumers. And this is a perfect example. Packaging material up 50%, which is crazy when you consider that in passive things like resistors, the packaging material is already more expensive, more costly than the resistors that it's packaging. So we're in uncharted territory here. I want to talk a little bit about labor because in my opinion, once we get through these part shortages, what we're all going to be dealing with in our businesses for a long time to come is labor scarcity. The fact of the matter is, I believe in the next 10 years, demand is going to grow a lot faster than labor pool. And what that means is we're all going to have to get very deliberate about automating and reducing the labor content in whatever it is we do. Lead times, which, when the lead times fall, that is going to be the signal to all of us that things are starting to, quote, normalize. Quite frankly, I don't think things anytime soon are going to settle back to where they were pre-pandemic, whether we're talking about lead times, whether we're talking about cost inputs, or whether we're talking about resales. I think some of the gains that have happened through this cycle are going to stick. And as Glenn had talked about, and I couldn't agree with him more, he made the comment in his presentation that just in time does not work for sole source parts. And I would build on that and say, one of the things that's causing us a lot of trouble is lots of stuff at a customer bill of material, way too much stuff is actually sole sourced. Even though the part itself may be a commodity, our customers have gotten in the habit over the years of only putting the time and energy and the cost in to qualifying one supplier and oftentimes just one part number from that supplier, which then means that there's a ton of pressure on their purchasing agents who then can't deviate from that one part number. So I take this another step further, and I would say that just in time, which has been the industry operating method from an OEM standpoint for the supply chain since the 80s. Let's call it the 80s. Toyota was famous for kicking this off. I think this has been on the verge of breaking for a long time. My personal opinion that all of the shocks that we're going through now are actually going to be the thing that finally gets this whole deal, how we buy things, how we plan things, to evolve. We have the technology for it, and this is something I've talked about in conferences and things in front of you guys many times over the years. What we don't have is all the right alignment of incentives in order to take advantage of that technology. But the pressures that we're dealing with, I do think make it absolutely essential that something changes. I've talked to a lot of customers, folks at big CMs, and one of the questions I always ask is, on the backside of this, what happens? Do we go right back to normal where everybody's just chasing cost, and so therefore the supply chain just clumps up in places that tend to have really bad weather and earthquakes and those kinds of things? Or are we going to take a bit more of the long view and make some different decisions about how we configure our supply chains? And generally the answer I'm getting is people are starting to believe there will be some lasting change coming out of this. So very quickly on semiconductors and automotive, which there's a lot of buzz about these days. A couple of things to keep in mind, that in terms of overall capacity in the semiconductor industry, the automotive market today will only chews up about 9% of that. But it is growing about 10% a year, so it's getting a little bit bigger. But don't lose sight of the fact that far and away computing and wireless and communications uses the vast majority of semiconductors today, and I don't think that's going to change in terms of a percentage anytime soon. The other thing to understand about automotive is it's using older technology, and therein lies part of the trouble for the automotive market, in that the manufacturers aren't necessarily thrilled with the idea of spending money on older technology, which by definition is less productive. Smaller wafers, larger feature sizes. They make a lot more money on the newer technology, larger wafers, smaller feature sizes, and that's slowing down this recovery. It's all over the news, what's happening on automotive. So one of the things creating additional pressure on automotive is the fact that EVs are real, and they are here, and they're coming on fast, and I think they're going to come on faster as a percent of the mix, EV versus gas engine, than even this chart indicates. And it's driven by the fact that the battery cost is falling. In fact, next year, the cost of an equivalent Toyota Camry in an electric version with over 300 miles range will be the same as the gas version of that Camry, and it's only going to go down from there. So the economics, the personal economics for all of us for EVs are going to get quite compelling. Just to put all this in context, though, 2017 was the peak for North American light vehicle production at almost 18 million. What we're looking at this year is a forecast of about 14.6. And quite frankly, almost 4 million of those vehicles aren't going to be able to ship because they're missing parts, mainly semiconductors. And the estimate right now is it's going to cost the industry about $110 billion in revenue. So this is why you're hearing a lot about automotive and semiconductor shortages, being driven by an increasing content of semis and electronics of all types in vehicles. And then this just came across the news a couple of days ago. I thought really drove it home. The CFO of Subaru had cited that Subaru is down to about 7 days worth of inventory. And 7 days is nothing. When you've only got 7 days of inventory, you better be getting ready to shut down your production lines. So let me step back as I finish up this section, and I want to point out one of the other things that I think is driving demand and is going to be a really big factor through the 2020s, and this is data generation. So this is a quote from the CEO of Cadence, and it talks about how much data is being generated, and the fact that right now most of that data is unstructured and very little of it's being analyzed, which means very little of it's being used. More and more of it's going to get analyzed and used. There's going to be more and more of it generated as we deploy more and more sensors. I think you guys are all aware of the trends there. So, and I say this a lot, we are never going to use less storage or less processing power than we use today. That's only going to escalate, and that, of course, is a big driver for all of us. So to wrap this up, I wanted to point out a couple of things that I think are very important, not only about the future of our industry, but and this is probably going to sound a little hoity-toity maybe, but also for the future of our species, quite frankly. Technology is extremely interesting to me from the standpoint it is actually not only tremendous in terms of the things it's done for us, and here's a couple of examples. Technology has had a huge role in lifting a lot of people out of poverty. Back in the 1800s, early to 1800s, 80% of the people were below the absolute poverty level. Today, it's less than 10%. In the developed world, in the same period of time, lifespans went from, on average, about 40 years to, on average, about 80 years, and that's actually accelerating almost in an exponential nature right now. And the fact of the matter is, I love this notion. There are animals on the planet now that regularly live more than 400 years. They're even discovering things that live 500 years, and you have things like, there's a thing called the immortal jellyfish, that if it doesn't get eaten, has the capability of almost living forever. So biologically, there is actually lots of evidence that even people can live a lot longer, a lot healthier than we do, and technology is starting to unlock those puzzles for us. And I think this is a very exciting time in the course of our species to be alive. I talk a little bit about leisure time, but on the flip side of that, technology is also creating some of the biggest existential problems that we're having to address. First and foremost, climate change, regardless of what you think is causing it, the fact that it's happening is real. And I think it's very difficult to argue anymore that the fact that we're contributing to that, and that's largely technology. We've got, obviously it's fossil fuel related, but it's a lot more than that. It's factory farming related. Cows actually contribute more to greenhouse gases these days, and cows and other livestock, than cars do. You have this problem with this growing mound of plastic that we're all generating that has a half-life right now of about 10,000 years. We've got technology today to develop new plastics. So I'm not saying we should get rid of plastic. I think we need different plastics that once they're done being used will revert back to organic components that do not have any harmful effect on the environment, on ourselves if it gets into our food chain and we ingest it. And then the other thing that's going on that I don't think is quite evident just yet, but is unavoidable, is climate change will start to roll back some of the progress we've made in terms of poverty reduction. Climate change and all of the consequences of it have an oversized impact on those at the bottom of the economic chain. That's something that I think we have to face and deal with. The good news is the technology is here today to address all of this and a lot more, and we're talking carbon capture and obviously green energy, and related to that, electric vehicles, as I've talked about in the past. Having an electric vehicle doesn't help the planet at all if what you're doing is charging it up with energy created from fossil fuels. If the energy has to come from, it has to be green, it has to be wind or solar, or my favorite, nuclear, quite frankly, and I could spend the next 30 minutes talking about nuclear fusion. We've got what's going on with CRISPR, which actually is, among other things, of course, it's going to help extend our natural productive lives, but it's also going to help us actually restore some of the species that we've wiped out as technology has progressed. And you have the whole artificial intelligence and quantum computing side of things, which drives all of this stuff forward at an exponential rate. So one last thing I want to call attention to, because it's related to all of this, it's a yin and a yang. One of the things that going forward is already quite disruptive and very expensive is cyber attacks. Cyber crimes are on the rise. You can see some stats here. On the right-hand side of this chart, it shows you number of cyber attacks by country. You know, here's the punchline. When you net out the cost, so by net out, I mean there's some economic benefit to cyber attacks, oddly enough, in that it creates a revenue stream for a lot of companies who are helping us all stave off a cyber attack. But then there's the cost of a cyber attack, and when you net it all out, it's about $1 trillion a year at the moment, up 50% from 2 years ago. In the next couple of years, though, it's projected to grow to something like $10.5 trillion. Totally unproductive. It's not helping anything. It's just an outflow. It's extremely expensive insurance that we have to buy to try to slow that down. Hopefully things like blockchain and AI and quantum computing are going to start to at last make a dent in this trend, because the fact of the matter is $10.5 trillion is $20 million a minute. Not helpful. So last thing I want to finish up with is this notion that we are moving into a sixth wave of innovation, and in this particular wave is a lot of what's underneath it is related to combating climate change. So a lot of the stuff we do is driven by this. And obviously it's a lot more. It's connecting everybody to the internet, which I've talked about, you know, this idea of a global network of satellites providing high-speed, low-latency connections. I think that is also hugely transformative for our species. But one of the things to notice here is the duration of these periods is getting shorter. So the concentration of the lift is getting greater, and this feeds this whole idea of an exponential curve. So last, to kind of wrap all of this up, you know, I think this is an adage that's been true since the apple fell off the tree and hit Newton in the head. You know, what goes up must come down. I put a caveat on that, though, that maybe not all the time. So let me explain what's going on here. So first and foremost, significant cost inputs and increases in lead times are the reality right now. Not sustainable. I talked about the fact that bookings are going to have a reset. Things like lumber have already reset. That's working its way back down pretty quickly to post-COVID levels. You know, when you have this really drastic, fast artificial escalation, it's never fully sustainable. So what we've certainly learned through the history of our industry is that the sharper the rise, the sharper the decline. So that's what's got everybody on edge. When you know, this is a fun ride up, but historically what we've experienced, the ride down, not so much fun. So that's what's got everybody concerned. I personally think that with the state of innovation, how quickly technology is expanding through our world, the impact of technology in so many different ways is actually going to take the sharp out of this decline. There will be a decline. It's perfectly natural, but we are not falling all the way back to where we started from. Not happening. They talk about what is the, quote, new normal. Their normal is going to look different on the backside of this and going through the 2020s than it did before. And I've been feeling this, reading about this for years, and I see no reason at all to change my belief or stance on this. I was predicting, if you remember back in, I think, 2017 EDS, that by the time we got to 2020, things were really going to start to ramp. COVID did a little stutter step, but we blew right through that. When I look back, I think actually 100% of my assumptions about what was going to happen in this decade are coming true in spades, actually. So the last point that I will make about this, and this is something to ponder that has a lot of ramifications for all of our businesses, is the notion of exponential. What happens when you hit the second half of the exponential curve is things really start to shoot up very quickly. And with enough momentum, if we break free of the gravitational pull of everything that is historic business cycles, the way our government and education and all of our other institutions have functioned, I do really actually feel like we are on the cusp of something more revolutionary than evolutionary. It's very transformative and good for everybody ultimately, things like free and abundant energy, which I've talked about. So this is all enabled by the technology that all of us provide, that you guys that are component manufacturers develop, and therefore all of us are going to benefit from this.